Now, sports and games are a huge part of American and world culture. Stonebridge is a church that's filled with sports fans and with a whole lot of people who love to play games. Sports and games were also a big part of the ancient world, which is why you will find passages in the New Testament where the Apostle Paul uses athletic events and sports analogies to illustrate spiritual truth and to build bridges with people in the ancient world who hadn't grown up reading the Hebrew Bible but still knew something about how to, a sense of the reality and the existence of God. In this series that we're in right now, Game On, getting out of the bleachers and into the game, we're following Paul's example and Paul's lead and looking at some of the ways that the sports and the games that we love can give us a fresh insight and fresh perspective on biblical truth. Now, this week, we are turning our attention to a family of games that the vast majority of our population actually plays. Up to this point, we've kind of been talking about games that folks watch. These are games that we actually play. Video games. Video games are everywhere, and they've really come a long way since the early days of Pong and Pac-Man, some of you may remember. With receipts of over $25 billion a year, revenue from video games now outstrips that of films and recording industry. Find the long-held stereotype of gamers as being solitary teenage boys who are sitting alone in their rooms and drinking Red Bull. Everybody plays video games. 42% of people who play video games today are women, and that number is actually rising. That percentage is rising. Now, at one time, if you wanted to play video games, you would have to travel someplace to a video arcade with a pocket full of quarters. Today, video games are everywhere. We play them on our computers, on dedicated game consoles, on our iPads, on Androids. They are on social media sites. How many of you have gotten invitations to play Farmville on Facebook? We carry video games around in our pockets. I wouldn't be at all surprised if a whole bunch of you right now have video games on you in the form of your iPhone. Think Solitaire and Candy Crush. Over half of the apps that are sold on the iTunes store today are games. Over 90% of kids aged 2 to 17 play video games. One figure says 91%. Another says 98% of boys under the age of 11 play video games. It's everywhere. And 95%, I think, of girls, according to one study. Now, the first mention of something like video game dates back to at least, you ready for this, 1947, when someone filed a patent for a, quote, cathode ray tube amusement device. Tic-tac-toe appeared in 1952, and that's what it looked like. Tennis for two, a primitive precursor to Pong, came along in 1958. The very first home console was the Magnavox Audio, which was released in 1972. That was the same year, by the way, Atari's Pong appeared as an arcade game. In 1978, Taito's Space Invaders, which was originally an arcade game, became the first killer app and actually drove the sales of the Atari 2600, which some of you, I bet, actually had. Pac-Man appeared in 1980, and here we are entering into the golden age of the arcade video game. Donkey Kong, Frogger, and Centipede, all appearing in 1981. Mario Brothers, 1983, which, by the way, were a spin-off of Donkey Kong. The Legend of Zelda came along in 1986. Moving forward, SimCity in 1989, Super Mario World in 90, Sonic the Hedgehog, anybody remember him? 1991. Super Mario 64, which was one I kind of got into because it was the first kind of 3D graphics that you could play on a home console, was in 1996. The Sims showed up in 2000. World of Warcraft 2004. People have done studies on the World of Warcraft, and we now realize that people have spent more time playing World of Warcraft than human beings have, number of hours played, than human beings have actually existed on our planet. Angry Birds. How much fun is it throwing an angry bird at a bunch of pigs on wooden pilings? 2009. Minecraft, if you've got kids, you know what Minecraft is. That's only been around since 2011. And of course, the amazing Candy Crush, the incredibly addictive Candy Crush 2012. Now, for a lot of people, the mere mention of these titles brings back a flood of memories. And some of you may remember standing in arcades and playing games. Last night, I was sharing memories with another guy who did exactly what I did when Pac-Man first came out. We went out and bought a cheat book, learned there were only 4 patterns in Pac-Man, and we could play Pac-Man for hours on one quarter because we knew how to do it. I'm sure some of you would have liked me to mention other games that are near and dear to you. Now, while some of us are old enough to remember the painfully pixelated 8-bit color or even 1-bit monochromatic graphics of bygone days, kids that are growing up today will never know a world without incredibly rich, photorealistic virtual realities, which they can enter into, they can explore, they can experience, they can master, they can interact with. It looks like real life. Now, question is, now that was fun, but what's all that got to do with the Bible? And what does that have to do with Jesus Christ? Great question. And I want to draw, just like the Apostle Paul, looked at sports in the ancient world and saw some truth that was worth sharing with folks about the reality of God. That's really what I want to do in this message. Let's start with this one. One of the things that you realize when you play a modern state-of-the-art video game is it's obvious that that game didn't just come into being on its own or by accident. The narrative that guides a modern game today, and these narratives, by the way, are intriguing. When you go to a video game conference nowadays for video game developers, you know what video game developers talk about now? Designing games that will be so emotionally engaging and so emotionally involving that they will literally make you cry. And they've made games that do that, surprisingly. The narrative that guides the games, the incredible detail in the artwork, the underlying physics that gives these games their realistic look and feel, the sound effects that are placed in the video game, the musical score. One of the former members of our church actually is involved in writing music for these kind of scores for video games. The programming that makes it all possible. Some of the programming, incredibly elegant programming. You know what? That didn't just happen. It didn't just come into being on its own. It didn't just emerge by accident. There is an obvious creative intelligence behind every video game that you play. No matter how stupid the game is, there is a creative intelligence behind it. Not only that, when you play a video game, there are consistent rules without which, if a video game didn't have consistent rules, it would just be a frustrating, nonsensical series of random events that we would never play. There is a congruity between how the game works and how we think. There are clues, in other words. There are clues everywhere that point to a creator of these games. Now, the Bible teaches that the world that we live in was also created. Not only that, but as David says in Psalm 19, verse 1, the heavens declare the glory of God, and the skies proclaim his handiwork. And in that particular verse, David is not just describing the orderly motion of the planets, but he's actually providing us with a principle that all of creation, as you look around, if you're willing to think deeply about it, it shows signs of a design. it reflects the glory of God. There are clues everywhere that point to a creator. I want you to think about this. Why is it that the laws of nature, the fact that there are even laws of nature, they operate consistently, no matter where, and they operate in a way that perfectly corresponds to the structure and the operation of the human brain? You know, just like a video game corresponds to us so that we can interact with it and have fun playing it. Isn't it amazing that the universe operates in a consistent way and that it perfectly corresponds to the operation and the structure of the human brain? The question is, was that just a coincidence? Is that just a random accident? Or might there be another explanation to that? Might there be some kind of explanation other than just randomness, that the DNA that makes each of us this incredibly complex double helix is not only filled with information, but also it's self-replicating information? Is that just accident? The Gospel of John opens with a verse, you're probably familiar with it. It sort of reflects Genesis chapter 1, the verse with which the entire Bible opens. John 1:1 says, "In the beginning was the Word." That word that's translated the Word is logos. And it's a term that was used in Greek philosophy. And it's a word that actually has a couple of meanings. One meaning is the universal divine reason that created and continues to guide and underlies everything in the world. It's what gives it its structure and its predictability and so on. But it's not just that meaning. It also means our human reason that perfectly corresponds to that reality outside of us. When Johannes Kepler, the great scientist and astronomer, he describes science as thinking God's thoughts after him. That's exactly what he was getting at. There's a divine logos, divine reason, and human reason perfectly corresponds to that. Is that an accident? That just happened because atoms bumped into each other? Does life just come into being out of non-life through accident? Look at any video game, and you'll see there are clues everywhere that point to a creative intelligence that designed it. Not just designed it, but designed it for a purpose. Here's a question for you. Does it make any sense to say that video games show signs of creative intelligence while the people who program the video games don't? My daughter's boyfriend is a professional video game designer. And I think he would take offense if somebody said he showed no signs of creative intelligence. Does it make any sense to say that the virtual worlds that we immerse ourselves in are purposefully created, while the real world in which we live every day is uncreated and random and ultimately meaningless? An unguided accident. J.R.R. Tolkien, the great author of The Lord of the Rings, not only did he write this incredible fantasy literature, but he also he's a great academic, and he wrote about literature and understood literature and so on. And one of the things that Tolkien wrote about is he refers to the things that we create, whether it's literature or video game. He refers to these things as sub-creations. The reason that we want to create and the reason we are able to create secondary worlds is because we are created in the image and likeness of our Creator who created the primary world, the real world in which we live. Whether we acknowledge God or not, the imaginary worlds that we create in some measure reflect the world that God has created, just as the minds that we use to make these worlds reflect the mind of God who created each one of us. I think video games have something really powerful and important to teach us and to say to us about the creative intelligence behind the world in which we live. Not just that, though. In addition to saying something about creation, I think video games can help us to see that there is more to life than meets the eye. A lot more to it. Shigeru Miyamoto, the man behind Mario, an incredible video game designer and creator, once asked this question. He said, speaking of video games, but there's a wider application, what if everything you see is more than what you see? That the person next to you is a warrior, that the space that appears empty is a secret doorway to another world. What if something appears that shouldn't? You either dismiss it or accept that there's much more to the world than you think. Perhaps it really is a doorway. And if you choose to go inside, you will find many unexpected things. That's really true in video games. You play adventure games, you pick stuff up and have a key, and a door mysteriously opens in what was once a wall. Miyamoto is describing something. It's not just unique to video games, though. Celtic Christians, early Christians from Ireland, the British Isles, they would write about the thin places. And what they meant by these thin places were places where heaven and earth come so close together that they almost seem to touch. Yesterday I was reading an article from The Guardian, great newspaper in the UK, and it was written by an atheist who was actually arguing that despite his atheism, one of the things that he has come to see, and he's sort of developed a reluctant respect for this idea, is that there really is more to the world than meets the eye. He happened to be, this particular writer happened to be in Milan, Italy one day, and he was able to get a ticket to see The Last Supper, which is a fresco. It's painted on a wall in a church in Milan. And the only time that he could go in to see it was on a Sunday morning, very, very first tour group. The entire city was pretty much asleep. All the people, he was with a group of about 20 people, they were all really sleepy. So as they went in to look at this fresco of Last Supper, they did so in complete silence. And as he stood looking at the Last Supper, he suddenly, out of the blue and completely unexpected, he was sort of transported. He had a hard time even describing what it was like, what happened to him, but he realized that it wasn't just him here in this physical world, but he was somehow experiencing something beyond his ordinary experience. And I think he's really on to something. The idea that there's more than meets the eye, we find this in all kinds of literature and stories with which not only you, but your kids are familiar. Lucy steps through a wardrobe, and she suddenly finds herself in Narnia, where she meets the great lion Aslan. Aladdin walking along, and he finds a lamp, and he rubs it, and suddenly a new reality emerges. Alice falls down a rabbit hole, and instead of falling into a rabbit's nest, she finds herself in another world. The Bible talks about those kinds of experiences over and over again. In the Bible, Jacob finds himself in a thin place where he sees a stairway that is joining heaven and earth, and angels are going up and down on this stairway. And Jacob says, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I did not know it. This is none other than the house of God, Bethel, and this is the gate of heaven." One of the things that video games can show us is that there are gates to unexpected places all around us. And it's not just in games, it's in the real world. Video games remind us of a great truth. It's found throughout Scripture. This world isn't the only world. There is another world that is not far off, and it is a world that can break into this one without warning. A lot of video games appeal to our sense of adventure. And one of the reasons I chose our text today from Ephesians chapter 6 is because a number of the pieces of armor that the Apostle Paul talks about and the way he frames his argument about spiritual warfare feels very, very much like the kind of experience you would have in a video game where you'd put on your armor, you'd find armor to defend yourself, and so on. People love to play action-adventure video games because they allow them to be part of a team or even an army, to take part in a kingdom, to fight epic battles, to be engaged in a struggle of good against evil, to conquer incredible foes. I had an awesome Lord of the Rings game that I used to play. It had incredible 3D graphics and great gameplay. It made you feel like you were in the movie and that you were Gandalf and you were the one that was, defending people from an onslaught of orcs. You can spend a lot of time getting lost in a game like that. And it's fun. And that's one of the things about video games. They're fun. And there's nothing wrong with having fun. It's a good thing. Jesus came to bring us joy, and so we shouldn't feel bad about that. It's fun, though, with a meaning. Fun with a purpose, like Highlights magazine used to say when I was a little kid. It's good versus evil. It's a rush. But, and here's the thing. You know what? No matter how good you get at playing the game, when you're done playing the game, you turn it off, and guess where you find yourself? In the real world. And that's the point. Because while it's fun, really fun, it's really cool to be a warrior in the virtual world, we were created to make a difference in the real world. And that, folks, is an adventure. And that's real good versus evil. In Ephesians 6, when Paul advises that we put on all of our armor, it's not to play a video game. Paul's preparing people for a battle with a real enemy who wants to take you down and who wants to take your loved ones down. And it's life or death. It's high stakes. John Eldredge put it like this. He said, there is a glory to your life that your enemy, capital E, fears. And he is hell-bent on destroying that glory before you can act on it. The story of your life is the story of the long and brutal assault on your heart by the one who knows what you could be and who fears it. And that's not a game. That's real life. That's your life. That's your kids. It's your grandkids. Last week I learned something really interesting, how the Galatians held their ground for generation after generation, even though they lived on an indefensible plain with no natural fortifications. Look at that map, and you'll see that while Galatia was surrounded by mountainous terrain, Galatia itself is pretty much a valley. How was it that they were able to defend themselves? Just on a plain with no fortifications. Well, here's how. When they went into battle, they brought their wives and their children with them. Now, that may sound crazy, but here's this is the way that it worked. They knew that if they won, they got to go home with their loved ones. They also knew if they lost, their enemies would not only kill them, but they would take their wives and their children and do to them whatever they wanted. Do you think they weren't invested in winning the battles in which they were engaged? They didn't lose a battle for hundreds of years because, you know what, you fight differently when you're fighting for the people you love. Video games, great fun. They're awesome. And there's nothing wrong with having fun. but it's not real. It's not real. Just a reminder, being great at Guitar Hero doesn't make you a great guitar player. Two different things. And conquering, evil creatures on a computer screen doesn't really say anything about what you're doing in the real world. If you want to do something that matters, something that makes a difference, something that could actually change your life, and maybe even change the world, give your life to the real king. Not the one on the screen, the real king. And let him show you how to love and how to protect. Who knows, maybe even how to rescue the very real people that he's put in your life. Because video games are great fun, yeah. But it's sometime, time to get off of the sofa and into the game.